Hey everyone, loads of YouTube channels have been covering their big network upgrades to 10 gigabit, 25 gigabit or even 100 gigabit networking. So in this video I'm going to show off my own massive networking upgrade from 1 gigabit networking to 2.5 gig networking. Wait, what? Why did I spend almost £200 on loads of different networking switches for such a small speed gain? Why wouldn't I go straight to 10 gig? Why did I make loads of simple mistakes along the way? And why is this network switch dangling in midair? Well, the answer to that is you get better download speeds. Okay, maybe not, but I'm going to answer all those questions and more in this video by showing off my networking upgrade. And I'm going to start off by discussing my old networking setup. So my house actually has two different internet supplies outside of it, meaning I've got choice between loads of different ISPs, which is pretty useful. Those connections come into my understay's cupboard, and at the moment I have a 1 gigabit ISP package, and I can't go beyond that, but that's absolutely fine because for external download speeds, 1 gig is absolutely loads. But in this video I'm going to show off my LAN upgrade, so basically for the internal networking, how I moved from 1 gig to 2.5. And as you can see in my understairs cupboard, I got my internet coming in and that goes to a router that I have to use. I can't use my own, which is really annoying. But basically from the ISP router, that then connects to eero, which basically gives me Wi-Fi around the house. I've actually got 4 different eero points, which is really useful for getting really good Wi-Fi coverage. And then I also use network switches around the house to actually have wired Ethernet. And one of the great things of this house when I moved here 2.5 years ago is I found that actually it's got pre-wired Ethernet everywhere. So basically within the walls, it's got Cat6 cabling, and then on the actual wall sockets it's a Cat5e termination. But in general, I've got wired Ethernet everywhere, and that's brilliant. My computers connect to wired Ethernet, my TV does, my set-top box does, even my laptop, sometimes I'll plug in Ethernet if the Wi-Fi's been a bit dodgy, so I really like having that wired Ethernet. And what I actually did as well before doing out my garden was I actually run an Ethernet cable from my living room out to my detached garage, and in there I've then got network switches, I've got power over Ethernet, and I've also got an eero router there. So whether I'm in my garage or my garden or anywhere else, I've actually got really good Wi-Fi, but also wired connection via Ethernet as well. However, I've been getting into NASes a lot more recently, and I've moved over to a model where I don't have much storage on my local computer, and instead I want to edit over the network. And the problem with that is 1 gigabit isn't enough. And certainly for my study, because I have got a NAS in here from Linkstation, I could simply have a single network switch in this study that supplies really fast speeds between this particular computer and the fast NAS that I use for video editing. However, what I actually do is that once I'm actually finished with a video project, I want to actually archive things. So once I've scheduled a video on YouTube, I actually move those project files over to my HomeLab NAS, which is in my garage. And obviously that is with a 1 gigabit connection, and that's really slow. Equally, I've got more into Plex recently, and those Linux ISOs are stored on my HomeLab NAS as well. So again, if I'm moving them over there, then that's going to be slower because it's 1 gig. And I kind of figured that since this house is pre-wired with, Cat6 cabling and Cat5e terminations, I can probably get more than 1 gigabit. So I thought it's worth just trying to see if I can upgrade to something more. And that brings us to the big question, which is, should I go with 2.5 gig or 10 gig or even 100 gig? And the short answer is that the moment you move beyond 2.5 gig speeds, it becomes more expensive and more power hungry in general. I actually used to have a 10 gig UniFi switch, which was RJ45, and it was completely brilliant. It was rock solid. I never had connection dips or anything, but because it was RJ45, it was very power hungry. There's so much data moving across it that Ethernet almost isn't designed for that, and so there's a lot of power consumption and a lot of heat, and also I'd have to spend more money on the network switches because, the 10 gig UniFi switches are like £250 or something. But in 2024, Ubiquiti actually released the upgraded Flex Mini, which is 2.5 gig instead of 1 gig speeds, and they're fairly cheap as well. They're like £45. So I bought 4 of them for less than the cost of just a single 10 gig switch. And I need 4 because basically I need 1 in my understairs cupboard, 1 in my study, 1 in my living room, and 1 in my garage, if there's even a chance that I'm going to be able to upgrade to 2.5 gig, and so that I can actually move a file from here to, my archive NAS over my garage at the full 2.5 gig speeds. So next we move on to actually installing things, and surely that's simple, right? You just come along and anywhere I've got 1 gig switch, I just swap it out with a 2.5 gig switch, right? Well, that is sort of what happened, but also I needed to change the order of things a little bit because my eero routers have a 1 gig connection. It doesn't support 2.5 gig or 10. So it's got that 1 gig connection, and in my study, for example, I had the Ethernet cable come in here, that went into an eero router, and then from there was a connection to like my network switches and then ultimately my computer and things like that. But if I kept that particular order, then what would happen is essentially I'd have 2.5 gig come in from my understairs cupboard, but that would then go into a 1 gig Ethernet port on the eero in my study. And so even if I then reintroduce a 2.5 gig switch here, my computer ultimately is going to be limited by 1 gig. So in other words, I needed to change up the order of things a little bit, but that was easy enough. So for example, in the study, essentially the Ethernet cable goes to my new 2.5 gig UniFi switch, and then from there it can go to my computer and my NAS and actually give me 2.5 gig connection speeds. And then from there I can go to like a power over Ethernet switch for my CCTV cameras and not worry about that is actually, 1 gig, because everything else is starting off from that 2.5 gig base, which ultimately comes from the understairs cupboard. So anyway, that covers off the study, and the understairs cupboard I've already touched on, but essentially with that, I just needed to swap out, the 1 gig network switch for my Ubiquiti one. But one of the problems with these actual switches is they don't come with a wall mount or anything else. The 10 gig switches and stuff do, but yeah, these mini ones don't. And I'll probably have to buy a third-party one because having it dangling down like that's probably not great. Then we come to the living room, and that was a simple enough swap out. I mainly needed to actually fish the network switch out from under some furniture and swap things out there, but that was easy enough. Then I went to the garage and needed to change things there. And usually there's actually a really scary spider that really likes the network switches, but luckily there's no sign of Charlie. So I very hastily switched out the 1 gig switch for the 2.5 gig UniFi switch, and then I run back to the safety of this house without seeing any spiders, which was brilliant. But that's everything done. That's the understairs cupboard, the living room, this study, and also the garage. Next, I could actually test things out. And some network switches actually have like different color LEDs. So if you're connecting at 2.5 gig, you'll have a different color LED to if you're connecting at 1 gig. And that's actually not too helpful for me because I'm colorblind. But even if I could see the different color LEDs, the UniFi switch doesn't actually have that. So don't really know why I mentioned that. But my point is that I needed to do something else other than just look at little LEDs and work out if things were connected properly. So what I did instead was jump on this computer, I got a local file, and I actually transferred it to my archive NAS, which is over in my garage, because that's ultimately the best test. So I kicked off the file transfer, and luckily it only got a gigabit speeds, which completely sucks. And due to the lack of LEDs and the number of points of failures, it could be the problem with the wall jacket, it could be a problem with the Ethernet cable or the switches or the order I've set things up. Due to the number of points of failure, I didn't really know where to start. But luckily I actually remembered something, which is that this UniFi switch is a managed switch. I mean, the way I'd set things up by just plugging them in and plugging and playing meant that they were more like an unmanaged switch, but you can actually get UniFi software that then gives you loads of details about all your connected devices and the connection speeds and everything else. And there's lots of different ways of installing this software. I did actually originally try putting it on Unraid, which is what's running on my HomeLab NAS, but UniFi have recently changed the version of the software, so in the end I got fed up with that and I just used the simple Windows installer. And that installed really easily, and very quickly I could see my 4 networking switches there. And the first task then was to work out which switch was which. So I basically played a detective game and I looked at each switch and I looked at what was connected and whether it was connected to another, UniFi switch, or whether it was the last in the chain, like in the study and the garage. And eventually I could work out which device was which. So I'd given them the names, and then I went to the network topology page. And this page is incredibly cool, being able to see all of your connected devices and also see, the speed they're running at, and a bunch of other information is very, very useful for debugging. And I quickly noticed the issue, which is that my main HomeLab NAS, which was the whole point of this upgrade, was only running at 1 gigabit speeds. So I did some Googling, I looked at the motherboard specification to make sure that, as I already knew, that the port on that motherboard was 2.5 gig. And sure enough, it's 1 gigabit. Whoops. That was the entire point of the upgrade, is I convinced myself that my HomeLab NAS was running a 2.5 gig, LAN port via the motherboard which I was connected to. And yeah, I was wrong. The motherboard just has a gigabit LAN port, which is incredibly annoying. Anywho, PCIe networking cards, or NICs as they're called, they literally exist to move a computer from like 1 gig to 2.5 gig or 10 gig. And luckily for 2.5 gig, you can actually get networking cards incredibly cheaply, anything from like £10 up to £50, I guess. So I looked at a few different retailers and I noticed when it comes to networking cards, you can generally get ones from Realtek or Intel. And in general, Intel ones are better because they got more Linux compatibility, but they're also a lot more expensive. And when I'm presented with a choice like this, I do what I do best and I overanalyze absolutely everything. But after half hour of dithering and checking too many options, I decided to just order a card from Amazon, because if it didn't work, I could always just return it hassle-free. Usually I like to order from other tech retailers if I can, but in this case I just went with Amazon for the easy returns. So I bought a Mercusys one and the card arrived the following day. So I went into the Unraid dashboard for my HomeLab NAS, I turned off the NAS, then I went into my garage and I installed the PCIe card, which was really easy. It doesn't need separate power, it just gets the power from the PCI Express slot, and it's really, really easy. So anyway, I put my HomeLab NAS back on and I repeated the same test as I'd done the previous day, and it worked. I was getting the full connection speeds that I was expecting, which means that my networking upgrade was a success. It also means that at parties I can introduce myself by saying, "Hi, I'm Tristan and I've got 1 gig WAN and a 2.5 gig LAN," because I'm an impressive kind of guy. So that sums up what I did. I'd be eager to hear from you down in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up button and please subscribe to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.